it was an important event in American history. And it was a move that the government made that was wrong. It was unconstitutional. And it was actually supported by the Supreme Court at the time. And it was an event that ultimately was reversed both by the Supreme Court and by the government. The government issued a formal public apology to every internee after the war, and the surviving internees anyway. So that's one of the reasons. It's something that I think we, as a country, need to own up to. We need to learn from it, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again today. And sadly, there are things happening in today's world that are just very reminiscent of what happened in 1942. And the targeted population now isn't the Japanese, but it's the Muslim population. And in certain circumstances, Hispanics, mainly from Mexico. But the dialogue, the discussion, the kinds of remedies being sought by certain groups is exactly the same kind of thing that happened in 1942. So it's important in that regard. And the other is, I believe in the United States. I believe in our form of government. And I consider myself a true patriot. And the fact that my country, after having made this horrendous, tragic decision, reverses that and in a very formal, public apology says, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. And the underlying message is, you were right all along. And I think that's an important thing, particularly for the Japanese community to have heard. So those are the two main reasons why I feel a mission to share my story. I don't have any feel for percentages or numbers. I think in general, most of the people lost everything. Most people lost their homes. Most people that had businesses or farms lost their farms. In those circumstances where friends of the family, or in some cases the church, stepped in and tried to help, even in those instances, for example, some of the people were allowed to leave their belongings in the basement and in storage sheds connected with the church. During the war, people came in and stole all of that stuff. So in the end, even though the church and various people had tried to help them, they still ended up losing everything. But in terms of numbers and percentages, I don't have a feel for that. Other than just to say that I think that my family and my uncle's family, who were the two families in Atwater, we were among the very fortunate ones because we actually did have something to come home to. The judge basically was the one who set up the legal contract for us. And part of that contract was that he was allowed to rent our property, which he did. He rented it to a family, basically to have the house maintained so that it wouldn't get run down. The person that rented it, I don't believe, had any responsibility for the farm. So essentially the farm was not operated. Fruits and the almonds were not harvested. None of the crops were harvested. And basically it was all allowed to go to seed during that time. the result of that was that any income from the farm was essentially lost by my parents. If there had been an income, I think the judge and the other men would have ensured that it went into an account for us. But for whatever reason, they did not help to maintain the farm. I heard a story years later that the judge, on hearing from my parents when we were planning to arrive back in Atwater, he gave notice to the family that was living there during that time. And he told my parents that initially the families objected and said no, they weren't going to leave. That as enemy aliens, we did not deserve to come back to Atwater, and certainly didn't deserve to come back to the property. What was interesting about that is that the property was owned by my mother, so it wasn't as though we were coming back to something that didn't belong to us. Anyway, the judge told my parents that he told the family, "You don't know who you're dealing with here. You either leave or you're going to be seeing me in court." And then he told, with kind of a chuckle, he told my parents that the family very quickly left. So we had our home to come home to, and basically it had been cared for while we were gone. Yeah, it was a complicated deal. I actually don't know what he personally felt, because they would just never talk about it. But I know the dilemma that they faced. First of all, as an immigrant alien, he was not allowed to become a citizen. And yet the question 28 was asking him to declare loyalty to the United States. Only a citizen can declare loyalty to their home country. So it was a meaningless question. The second part of the question, though, asked them to renounce any loyalty to the emperor. My father had been in the country several decades by the time of being asked this question. So he had no loyalty to the emperor other than possibly some sentimental issues connected with that. But then if he were to renounce loyalty to the emperor, he would become a non-citizen of Japan. Being a non-citizen of the United States, he would then be a person without a country. So for all of the adults, it was a very difficult, impossible situation. And the suspicion among the adults in camp caused them to wonder why this question was being asked. One of the possibilities that they came up with was, if they gave the wrong answer, would they be shipped back to Japan? Would they be sent to a federal prison beyond just being in the internment camp? So it was a tragic, impossible situation for the Issei to answer that question. Yeah, David served in the Navy. He served one tour. In fact, he was. One story he shared was that he was on a ship off of Japan. They weren't in any conflict situation, but he was on a ship out there. My middle brother, Gene, was in the Marine Corps, and he was off the coast of Laos at one point. And he said he knew things were serious when they handed out live ammunition. Now, they ended up not going ashore, but apparently he was prepared to do that. As to Gene and David's stance about the military, I think they were two different people. Gene, I think of as a John Wayne Marine, and he was totally gung-ho, very macho in that kind of thinking. He even walked around. You would think he would, just looking at him, you would think he was a John Wayne Marine, just by the way he held himself and the way he walked. And when he told stories about incidents as a Marine, they came out as very bold, brash, very energetic, and just full of energy, and you would associate that with a Marine. He was a typical Marine. David, on the other hand, I always saw him as the happy-go-lucky kid in our family, and in one way it was kind of a surprise that he did join the military, but it was at a time when there weren't that many conflicts around the world that he would get into. And he did his service and he came out, and that was the end of it. But again, I think they were two different people. I came out of it, first of all, as I was more aware and conscious of the kinds of situation that involved the internment compared to them. And in my religious training in the Methodist Church, there were some people that were very powerful influences on me, and even figures like Gandhi, who obviously I never met but read about and studied. They had an influence on me, and they did so in a way that for whatever reason didn't have an impact on Gene or David. Anyway, that's part of the reason for how we were different. And the other thing that kind of interesting came up in my interviews before the Selective Service Board was the Methodist Church is not considered a traditional peace church like the Mennonites or the Quakers. So how could I claim conscientious objector status being a Methodist? And my response to the board basically was that while the Methodist Church is not a traditional peace church, it supports any of its members in whatever stance they take in relationship to selective service. So it supported me in my claim as a conscientious objector, but it also supported my two brothers who did join the service. Yeah, you stood in line, and it was first come, first serve. I think on occasion they ran out of food, so people at the end of the line, they had to scrounge around and make something for them. But mostly it was just, if you got there early, you got to the line quickly. If you got there late, it was a long time just passing through the line to get your plate of food. And that happened with all the meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was very chaotic. The noise level was always high. So even at the table, talking with family, you had to speak out loud, really, to be heard. They were internees, some of whom had been cooks in previous life. Others were just adults who, that was a job. They didn't get paid very much, but that was a job that they signed up for. So they were actually employed by the camp administration. Yeah, it was the same for all of that. some of the other jobs, I mean, they had a post office, so people were hired as post office workers. There was a local police, so people were hired as local police. Yeah, these were all internees. There was a store, so people had to be hired to run the stores and things. Yeah, these were all internees. And for the schools, there were some internees who had been teachers before being interned. So they were hired by administration to teach classes. Most of the teachers were from teachers that were on loan from communities outside the camp. There were doctors and dentists. Mostly they were internees. I think probably in all 10 of the camps, there were enough professionals coming into camp that they were able to hire doctors and dentists and nurses amongst the internees. Interestingly, the professional level people that were employed were paid, I think, something like $26 a month. And then those that were non-professional, like cooks in the kitchen, it was something like $13 a month or something like that. In those instances, they would be transported usually by ambulance to one of the larger cities outside. Amache was just outside of Granada, and Granada was just a really tiny, tiny town. It wasn't even a city. And it was in the farthest southeast corner of Colorado. So we were probably 2 hours minimum distance from any center that would have a medical facility, probably even farther. Denver was probably more like 6 hours, even by ambulance. Ooh, that's a good question. I think that there was a hospital on site, so I think that was where he was born. Essentially, everything was provided for you. All your meals were paid for, your housing was paid for, your medical care, if you needed it, was paid for. Those people that actually came and had money that they brought with them or had access to, and those that were employed by the camp who earned money had bank accounts there. They could buy additional things, but basically like sheets and blankets and that sort of thing was provided by the camp itself. So if a person, adult, chose for whatever reason not to work, maybe they were too old, maybe they felt that being deprived of their civil rights and their constitutional rights by the government, they weren't going to do anything that in any way contributed to the government's program. They could do that because essentially all of their needs were taken care of by the camp. There's the store that I liken to what after the war we call the five and dime store. You know, it just had virtually anything and everything, and they called it a five and dime store because a lot of things you could spend a nickel for and buy. Paper tablets, pencils, marking pens, and things like that. Dishcloths, if you wanted them, although you wouldn't need them in your apartment because there was no running water there. And but if you wanted an extra blanket, you could buy that. You could buy clothing at the stores. And if you wanted something that you couldn't get at the local store, we had access to Sears and Roebuck catalogs, and so I remember we would get Buster Brown shoes, but we had to send away for those. I really don't know the answer to that. I know for me, coming out of that whole camp experience, I did feel a stronger sense of patriotism than I think I would have necessarily, given other circumstances. I think it played a major role in a negative way, largely. I think that peer relationships are very powerful, particularly in school-aged children, and wanting to be accepted is a very dominant, powerful effect on the kinds of decisions people make. Coming back from camp, there were only 5 of us kids in school that were Japanese. And while there was some other smattering of races, basically we were the only alien people that were associated with the war, which had just ended. So I think for all of us kids, we wanted to be as American as we could. I mean, I tell the story at one point that somewhere in grade school until I was in high school, I didn't use my middle name, which is Hideaki, Japanese. My sister's middle name was Akiko, Japanese. My brother Gene, his middle name was Naoshi, Japanese. David, who was born in camp, had a different middle name, Charles, which was American in our view. So that was part of what was happening. And probably from early in grade school until I was in high school, I didn't associate myself with anything that had to do with Japan, in terms of the culture, in terms of wanting to learn the language. Both my parents offered to teach us Japanese, and all of us declined. We didn't want anything that made us look different or sound different than what we thought of as true Americans. In hindsight, now as an adult, it was a major loss because I lost a lot of the culture. I definitely lost the language, which I would dearly love to have now, but it's way too late. When I started in high school, I began to kind of make links back to the culture, and I started to read up some on it. And I talked with my grandfather about what his life was like, and through those kind of storytellings, picking up little bits of the culture. When I got into college and then after I graduated, I developed a fascination with history, particularly with American military history. And I was still a little cautious about the war in the Pacific, and I didn't want to read anything there because I had heard and knew about the atrocities that the Japanese military had perpetrated as they waged war. But then I picked up a book about Midway, and so I started then reading about the war with Japan in the Pacific. So even though that's not a part of the culture that is a positive part, I did actually throw myself pretty strongly into studying what happened in that war. Not an easy thing, it was uncomfortable, but it was a part of this history that was real and that I felt ultimately I needed to be aware of. So I guess in sum, I lost a great deal, I think, in terms of the culture, in terms of a sense of identity, in terms of just basic knowledge of my history, and kind of the stories about my family. Actually, I'm pretty excited about the reaction. In each instance, the teachers that are involved, first of all, they're superb teachers. So they've set it up such that the kids are interested and excited. Interestingly, the youngest I've given it to were third graders, but I've given the talk to fourth, fifth, and sixth graders. And fairly recently to high school juniors. For whatever reason, they just didn't have very many questions. The ones who did were the third graders. Now, they were not real profound, deep questions, but they were the most excited overtly, and they had the most questions of all. And that was kind of fun. I did have to tone it down and use language more suitable to them, being at the younger age. But that I think they were the most fun I've had with the kids. Yeah, I think in a way it has been somewhat of a healing. I think for a long time I wasn't aware of consciously emotions that were connected with the evacuation and internment. Obviously, at age 4, a lot of my memories were such that I would not have been aware of the kinds of things that were happening, or necessarily have any emotions about them. But as I learned more about what had happened and why, I think I had a deep sense of anger, resentment about it, feelings that I thought my parents should have had, but they weren't expressing, which was a puzzlement. Why didn't they feel that? Why didn't they share it? Why didn't they tell me how they were handling it? So in talking about the experiences, I think what has been happening is that I've been able to allow myself to feel the anger, the embarrassment that I was feeling, any sense of guilt, for example, with Pearl Harbor, even though I didn't do it, I looked like the people that did. So I think in sharing the stories and talking about it out loud makes it real, and I think the anger has lessened. I think there's still some remnants of it there. I think part of my sense of justice is connected with feeling victimized and being hurt by the actions taken by the government. And so in a sense I want to make up for it and to extract some sort of payment. But again, I think talking about it has helped a lot to help me over that and grow and mature from that.